you think this is a prop from a horror movie. A mask created for some second-rate slasher, stitched from rough leather and wax. But this isn't latex, it was a face. A human face turned into a frozen grimace of pain and decay. For centuries, faces like these were everywhere. On the streets of London, in the royal palaces of Versailles, in the cradles of newborn infants. Emperors and beggars saw them in mirrors. They were worn by queens and prostitutes. They were worn by children who had not yet learned to speak. And no one considered them anything out of the ordinary. It was simply the price of survival. The brand that proved you were still breathing. The most sinister stories of smallpox begin somewhere in the dark heart of the Middle Ages, when the plague seemed like the shadow of God. Faces disfigured by oozing blisters resembling molten wax. Thousands of corpses that no one was left to bury. A universal, paralyzing fear of the inevitable wrath of God, from which neither prayers nor money could save you. But the truth is much, much older. Its traces are found on the mummified skin of Egyptian pharaohs who died 3,000 years ago. Ramses V, the great ruler, went to the afterlife with a face pockmarked by characteristic sores. The disease did not spare even those considered living gods. His priests, masters of embalming, could not hide the traces of the disease, even under layers of resin and linen bandages. In India, in despair and terror, people worshipped the goddess of smallpox, the malevolent and capricious Shitala. It was believed that in her anger, she threw her pearl necklaces at people, and where the beads touched the skin, pustules would instantly erupt, swelling with pus and suffering. Chickens and goats were sacrificed to her, hoping to quench her bloody hunger. When she entered a village, people locked themselves in their homes, not daring even to look in her direction, lest they incur her wrath. In China, there was an entire divine bureaucracy responsible for smallpox, headed by Lady Smallpox Tu Shen Niang Niang. It was believed that she sent the disease to children to test their life force. If a child survived, it meant they had passed a divine test. If they died, it meant they were not worthy enough. Death was not a tragedy, but a divine verdict on the weakness of the lineage. In Korea, epidemics, according to legend, were brought by a powerful spirit called the Honorable Smallpox Guest. He was not cursed, he was feared and pleaded with. Altars were built for him, offering the best food, wine, and rice cakes, hoping that, once sated, he would leave without taking too many lives with him. This was not an enemy, but a powerful force that had to be negotiated with. The family of the sick person would not cry, so as not to offend the guest, but would instead hold a celebration, hoping to appease him and persuade him to leave on good terms. The disease was a curse from the gods, a punishment from the heavens, a blind fate. Nothing could be done. All that remained was to pray, to appease, or to die. This fatalism was woven into the very fabric of society, into its myths and rituals, into its lullabies and funeral rites. And in the end, smallpox became commonplace, horrifying, but an inseparable part of life. Fighting it was as useless as fighting the coming of winter, so much so that in the works of the great Hippocrates, the father of medicine, Almost nothing is said about it. It was simply the background, a part of the natural order of things, like the changing of the seasons. The first to attempt to describe it with any medical clarity was the Persian physician Al-Razi in the 10th century. He discarded mysticism and tried to look into the essence of the disease. According to his theory, smallpox begins when the blood boils, like wine in the process of fermentation, and tries to escape. He believed it was a process of cleansing the body of excess moisture inherited in the womb. Then blisters appear on the body, an outlet for this spoiled, fermenting blood. Al-Razi was the first to draw a clear distinction between smallpox and measles, two diseases that were constantly confused before his time. The best thing to do, he advised, was to stay away from the sick. Otherwise, the disease could erupt into an epidemic, passing from one boiling body to another. His observations were strikingly accurate for their time, but they offered no cure other than isolation. But before the virus literally begins to eat away at the skin, there is an incubation period. About 12 days of silence and false hope. 12 days when a person feels perfectly healthy, goes to work, hugs their children, kisses their wife. 12 days when, without knowing it, they become a biological time bomb, spreading invisible death with every breath, with every touch. The disease itself begins suddenly and brutally, with fever, aching bones, an excruciating headache, and vomiting. The body burns from within, as if in a furnace, the temperature soaring to 40 degrees Celsius. The face reddens and swells. The eyes become bloodshot. The mucous membranes of the eyes and mouth swell, making breathing and swallowing difficult, turning every breath into torture. It is like the most terrible flu imaginable, but this is only a prelude to the real horror. Only then, on the 3rd or 4th day, does the rash appear. First on the face and in the mouth, then on the arms and legs, gradually covering the entire body, including the palms and soles. The body becomes a map of hell. At first, they are just small red spots, similar to insect bites. But after a few days, they begin to grow, filling with clear fluid, turning into vesicles. Then microbes penetrate them, and the blisters fill with thick yellow pus. They become hard to the touch, deep set in the skin, like buckshot embedded in the body. The skin becomes a battlefield, strewn with thousands of purulent mines, ready to explode at the slightest touch. Pain becomes a constant companion, and a nauseating, sweetish smell of decay emanates from the body, permeating the clothes, the bed, and the room itself. If you survived this stage, you were lucky. The pustules would dry up, forming hard, black scabs that caused an unbearable itch. A person would want to tear off their own skin just to get rid of the sensation. Over time, the scabs would fall off, but they left behind deep, permanent scars, pockmarks, a brand you would carry for the rest of your days, reminding everyone that you had looked death in the face and survived. However, this was the typical course of smallpox, one of the most favorable outcomes, known as the discrete form. Here, the pustules were separate from each other, leaving patches of healthy skin in between. The mortality rate was only 6%. Survivors were left with ugly scars, sometimes blindness due to corneal damage, but they kept their lives. But the disease had other, far more terrible faces. The second type was confluent smallpox. This is when the pustules are so numerous that they merge, forming one gigantic pus-oozing lesion covering vast areas of the body. The skin would literally peel away from the flesh like wet paper. The face turned into an undifferentiated mass of pus and blood, from which only swollen eyes and lips protruded. With this form, up to 45% of cases were fatal, and the survivors were transformed into living monsters whose facial features were impossible to distinguish. And there was the most severe, most terrifying type: hemorrhagic smallpox. This is when bleeding occurs not only in the internal organs, but also inside the blisters themselves. It was this form that was called black pox. The vesicles, instead of pus, fill with dark, clotted blood. The skin takes on a purplish-black hue, and blood begins to ooze from the eyes, nose, and mouth. A person would literally dissolve alive in their own blood, dying consciously from pain shock and blood loss. Here, the mortality rate was from 75 to 100%. It was a sight from hell itself, something almost impossible to survive. Europeans gave the disease a cold, clinical Latin name, variola vera, true smallpox. The word ospa comes from a Proto-Slavic root meaning rash, and it is believed that this plague was only able to truly cover the Old World after the invention of fast ships. Previously, during long voyages, the sick person would either recover or die, and the infection would burn out along the way. But now, with the development of seafaring, the disease learned to travel with man, crossing oceans. And when smallpox finally reached the Americas, a continent where the people had absolutely no immunity, it unleashed a true apocalypse there. It was an extinction-level event, comparable to an asteroid impact. The disease proved to be more terrifying than any of the conquistadors' weapons. It was their invisible, most loyal, and most cruel ally. In the 16th century, because of a single Spanish soldier in Hernán Cortés's party who brought the virus to the continent, several million people died in Central and South America. The ancient and powerful Aztec civilization, with its gigantic cities, complex culture, and thousand-year history, was almost completely wiped from the face of the earth, not so much by swords as by an invisible enemy. Their priests could not explain why their gods were punishing only them, leaving the invaders unharmed. It looked like a divine betrayal. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, a garden city on a lake, turned into a mass grave. People died so quickly that there was no one left to bury them. Bodies were simply thrown into the canals or left in houses, where they decomposed, spreading a stench. The survivors were too weak to work the fields, and soon famine was added to the epidemic. An entire civilization collapsed under the weight of a microscopic invader, clearing the way for European colonization. 2 centuries later, a new, no less terrible epidemic would begin. This time in North America, among the indigenous tribes. And this time, it would not be a tragic accident. It would be a cold-blooded, calculated act of war. At least, so goes one of the darkest legends in American history. I know that they are the most vile breed of creatures that ever infested the earth, and ridding the world of them should be considered a worthy deed for anyone who considers himself an Englishman. These are not the words of a mad fanatic. This is the text of a letter written by the British General Geoffrey Amherst, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in North America. He wrote this not in a fit of anger, but as a considered military proposal to his subordinate. It was read by Colonel Henry Bouquet, as well as William Trent, commander of the local militia during the famous Pontiac's Rebellion. The rebellion was named after the chief of the Ottawa tribe, who, having united many tribes, decided to drive the British from their lands. According to legend, it was at this war council, during the desperate siege of Fort Pitt, the site of modern-day Pittsburgh, that history took its darkest turn. The British position was desperate. English settlements were literally wiped out by the Indian tribes. Forts were falling one after another. Many soldiers and colonists fell victim to ritual cannibalism, performed in plain sight as an act of total war. Something had to be done, and done urgently, and someone, perhaps General Amherst himself, came up with a solution, as original as it was monstrous. What if they used the Indians' own vulnerability against them? What if they used smallpox as a weapon? A smallpox epidemic had already swept through the vicinity of Fort Pitt that spring. By the time the siege began in the summer, the British had already built a special isolation hospital, full of items used by the infected: blankets, handkerchiefs, clothing. It was an arsenal waiting for its moment. The British commanders came up with a diabolical idea. Why not gift these items to the Indian chiefs as a gesture of goodwill during peace negotiations? Perhaps, in a couple of months, there would be no one left to fight. The virus would do all their dirty work for them, quietly, effectively, and without a single shot. It was the perfect war, with no losses on their side. At a peace meeting with negotiators from the Delaware tribes, a British representative, most likely William Trent himself, who kept a diary, presented them with friendly gifts. Among them were 2 blankets and a handkerchief, taken directly from the smallpox hospital. We gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief from the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect, he dryly recorded in his journal. An entry that would become one of the most horrifying pieces of evidence in history, proof that human cruelty knows no bounds. The British believed that this would be enough to ignite a full-scale epidemic and break the resistance. Many historians call this event the first documented case of biological warfare in history. However, the official report of the meeting makes no mention of blankets. There is food, there are drinks, but no bedding. It is quite possible that this is all just a grim legend, born of hatred and fear. Besides, the Indians never took Fort Pitt. Not because they all died of smallpox, but because reinforcements arrived for the British in time. If the first biological weapon did exist, it worked, to put it mildly, poorly. But the idea itself had been born. The idea of using disease as a tool of power and genocide. As we have already mentioned, smallpox always left its mark on survivors. They were called pockmarked. And, according to many researchers, this disease directly influenced the development of European fashion and the cosmetics industry. To hide the ugly scars, many women, and later men, from high society began to use a thick layer of powder, white lead, and rouge. Thus, deathly pale, aristocratic skin came into fashion. It was a mask designed to hide the damage caused by the disease. A mask that was itself poisonous, slowly poisoning its wearers with lead. But people also noticed something else, something far more important. Anyone who survived smallpox once never got it again. They became immune to it. This simple observation, made by nameless people over centuries, gave rise to a brilliant and at the same time terrifying idea: to trick the disease by intentionally contracting it, but in a milder form. In Turkey, for example, they would mix the scabs and pus of the sick, creating a gruesome substrate. Then they would take young girls, often intended for sale to the Sultan's harems, and make small incisions on their skin, by the navel, on the right palm, and on the left ankle. Then they would rub this disgusting mixture into the fresh wounds. Since the infection entered through the skin, and not through the lungs as with natural infection, the disease was significantly milder. The girl's beauty, their main commodity, was not spoiled. In fact, various folk healers and medicine men had been doing something similar for centuries in different parts of the world. But it was in Turkey that this procedure caught the attention of the English ambassador's wife, the intelligent and eccentric Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. There are some old women here who perform these operations every autumn in September when the heat subsides, and there is not a single case of anyone dying from it, she wrote home. The method was called variolation, from the Latin variola. In reality, Lady Mary was being disingenuous or was overly optimistic. The method was deadly dangerous. The risk of dying from such an inoculation was about 2%, but that was still 10 times better than the 20% chance of dying from a natural infection. It was a cruel but pragmatic calculation. Lady Montagu, herself disfigured by smallpox and having lost her brother to it, was full of resolve. Her own beauty had been destroyed by the disease, and she did not want the same fate for her children. She had her 5-year-old son, Edward, inoculated in this way, and upon returning to England, brought variolation to Europe. She managed to convince King George I, who, however, was in no hurry to risk his own children. He authorized an experiment on 6 prisoners from Newgate Prison, 3 men and 3 women, sentenced to death. They were offered a choice, the gallows or variolation. The procedure was successful. All 6 survived, received a royal pardon, immunity to smallpox, and served as living advertisements for the rest of society, proving the method was safe. But even a person correctly inoculated by variolation was still contagious for several weeks and could trigger a new, full-blown outbreak of the disease. And they could still die with that same 2% probability. Therefore, in some families, children were often inoculated as early as possible, in infancy, so that the parents, as was cynically said in those days, would not have time to grow too attached to them. Yes, those were the times. Cruel, but pragmatic. It was a game of Russian roulette where the cylinder had 50 cartridges, and only one of them was a blank. In Russia, variolation became popular and even fashionable at the court of Catherine the Great. The Empress had already seen the ugly scars that smallpox had left on the face of her unloved husband, Peter III, and was terrified of contracting it herself. She secretly summoned a doctor from England who inoculated her and her son, the heir to the throne, Paul. The donor of the smallpox material was a 6-year-old peasant boy named Sasha Markov. He survived the procedure, received a noble title, a thematic family crest depicting a hand with a smallpox pustule, and an addition to his surname, Ospeni. Thus, the peasant boy entered history, becoming a living symbol of enlightened absolutism. Mothers who later brought their children for inoculation were given a specially minted silver ruble from the treasury. And all would have been well, but the medicine of that time was full of barbaric prejudices. In many countries, it was believed that for successful variolation, it was not the virus that should be weakened, but the person themselves. According to medical canons, before the procedure, people were kept on a strict starvation diet for 6 weeks, periodically bled, and given enemas to cleanse the body. As a result, by the time of infection, the person was exhausted and weak, which only increased the risks. In London alone, in the 40 years after the introduction of variolation, the vaunted 2% mortality rate resulted in 25,000 lost lives. It was a city in a constant state of a quiet epidemic, provoked by the cure itself. The search for a safer and more humane method had to continue. Humanity desperately needed a real breakthrough, something that would not require dicing with death. And at the end of the 18th century, A simple English country doctor named Edward Jenner found it. Or, at least, so he thought, as he stepped into territory that would forever change medicine, but also raise complex ethical questions that haunt us to this day. On that day, May 14, 1796, Jenner invited his gardener, a Mr. Phipps, to his home, along with his wife and their 8-year-old son, James. Phipps was a poor, uneducated man. For years he had received bread and a roof over his head from his employer, Dr. Jenner, but there had never been such formal meetings and serious conversations before. The topic was smallpox, about what a terrible, merciless disease it was, and that there was still no real, safe cure. But explaining what smallpox was at the end of the 18th century was unnecessary. Everyone knew about it, both doctors and gardeners. Everyone had seen its marks on the faces of their neighbors. Everyone had buried a relative who had burned up with fever. Then Jenner laid out a stack of some notes on the table, his observations, and said the most important thing, the very reason he had initiated this conversation. "I think I know the solution." Then the doctor explained his theory. For several years, as a country doctor, he had observed how people contracted the so-called cowpox. It was a well-known disease that affected the udders of cows and was also transmitted to humans. It also caused a rash and pustules, but unlike natural smallpox, it was practically harmless to humans. Milkmaids, whose hands often came into contact with the pus of sick cows, would develop a few blisters and a slight fever, but that was all. No one ever died from cowpox. Moreover, Jenner noticed that these milkmaids did not later contract natural smallpox, even during the most ferocious epidemics. They were as if marked with an invisible sign of protection. "I am certain," said Jenner, looking the parents straight in the eye, "that if we use material from a cowpox pustule for variolation, it will work just as well as an inoculation with human smallpox. But there will be absolutely no risk of death." His theory was elegant and logical, but it needed proof. And for that, a volunteer was needed. A person who had never had either smallpox or cowpox. Ideally, a child. It was then that Jenner proposed to Mr. Phipps to use his son, 8-year-old James, for this risky demonstration. History does not record how Mr. Phipps and his wife reacted to this, to say the least, strange and frightening proposal. It is also unknown why Edward Jenner, having a son of about the same age himself, chose a little boy for his dangerous experiment, especially the son of his own servant. From the perspective of modern ethics, this was a flagrant act of abuse of power and trust. But the fact remains. The parents, who trusted the doctor and perhaps did not fully understand all the risks, agreed. On May 14, 1796, in the presence of witnesses, Edward Jenner made 2 small incisions on James Phipps's arm and rubbed into the material taken from a cowpox sore on the hand of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms. The boy developed a slight fever and felt unwell, but he fully recovered after a few days. The first part of the experiment was successful, but the most frightening and most important part was yet to come. To prove his hypothesis, Jenner had to take a monstrous step. 7 weeks after the inoculation, he had to intentionally infect the boy not with cowpox, but with real, deadly smallpox. Did 8-year-old James Phipps understand what was being done to him and why? Was he afraid when the doctor approached him again with a lancet, on the tip of which was now not harmless cowpox, but a deadly human infection? Medical historians often justify the famous doctor by saying that he simply could not experiment on his own son. Several years earlier, Jenner had performed a standard variolation on him, which the boy endured with great difficulty, almost dying, but ultimately survived and gained immunity. But little James Phipps also survived. Jenner introduced smallpox material to him, but the boy did not get sick. No reaction. He was completely protected. In the following years, Edward Jenner tried to infect James with smallpox several more times, to be absolutely sure. The boy never fell ill. The experiment, however unethical it may have been, was a complete success. In 1798, the doctor published a small pamphlet about his research titled An Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of Cowpox. And in this document, the word vaccination, and later vaccine, appeared for the first time in history. After all, it concerned cowpox and its effect on human immunity. In Latin, vacca means cow. At first, Jenner's discovery was long laughed at. Newspapers printed caricatures depicting people who had been inoculated with cow heads and tails. The public genuinely believed that vaccination could turn a person into a cow. But the very next major epidemic put everything in its place. The subjects of the caricatures survived and remained healthy, while many of their creators and readers either died in agony or were disfigured by smallpox, and not on paper, but in real life. But soon, a new logistical problem arose. To create the vaccine, fresh material was needed, a live cowpox virus. It was impossible to store it for long or transport it over great distances. To deliver the life-saving vaccine to the Spanish colonies in South America in 1804, the personal physician of the Spanish king, Francisco Javier de Balmy, proposed an ingenious and simultaneously gruesome living chain method. And once again, children became the main heroes and victims of progress. Balmas gathered 22 boys aged 3 to 9 from Spanish orphanages who had never had smallpox. Before the ship set sail, 2 children from this group were vaccinated. When fresh pustules appeared on their arms 9-10 days later, the contents of these pustules were used for a new batch of vaccine, which was immediately administered to 2 more boys from the group. This arm-to-arm chain of virus transmission continued throughout the entire journey across the Atlantic. Thus, using children as living incubators, the Balmy's expedition delivered the live vaccine to America and saved millions of lives. The children, who became unwitting vessels for salvation, were bargaining chips in the great game against death. The early vaccine had one serious drawback. Since the material was often transferred from one person to another without any real purification or processing, along with immunity to smallpox, one could accidentally contract, say, syphilis or tuberculosis. Therefore, from 1898, it was decided that the vaccine would be prepared exclusively in specialized institutes, using lymph from infected calves, certified cows with known pedigrees, kept in sterile conditions. The great bacteriologist Robert Koch added another important step. The collected scabs and lymph from infected cows were to be treated with glycerin to destroy all extraneous microbes, leaving only the vaccinia virus. The glycerinated vaccine became the world standard and was widely used throughout the world, including in Russia. Soon, the Soviet Union, thanks to its comprehensive healthcare system and mandatory vaccination, became the first country to completely eradicate smallpox within its territory. The process was accompanied by a powerful propaganda campaign. The last case was caught and neutralized in 1936. The disease, which had terrorized the country for centuries, seemed to be gone forever. Almost a quarter of a century passes. The country is preparing to welcome the new year, 1960. Few people remember smallpox anymore. The war, Stalinist repressions, the Gulag, all of this seemed to be in the past. Now, despite the winter frost outside, the country was experiencing the Khrushchev thaw. Liberalization, the fight against the cult of personality, relative creative freedom. Some vetted citizens even began to be allowed to travel abroad, to capitalist and developing countries. One of these lucky individuals was the famous and honored Soviet poster artist Alexei Kokorekin, a two-time Stalin Prize laureate. In late December 1959, he returns home from a 2-week trip to India. He is full of impressions from the exotic country, and his suitcase is packed to the brim with foreign gifts for his wife, mistress, and friends. He talks incessantly about his walks through Delhi, the taste of unfamiliar dishes, and, of course, how he happened to find himself in Varanasi, the famous city of the dead, where ritual cremations of the deceased take place daily on the banks of the Ganges. But even through the storm of emotions, it was noticeable that Alexei Alexeyevich was not feeling well. "It's nothing serious," he told his wife, coughing. "I probably just caught a cold on the way, acclimatization. It's not every day you return from the Indian heat to a Moscow winter. A cup of tea with lemon, and I'll be good as new tomorrow." But the next day, Kokorekin did not get better. He got significantly worse. He developed a high fever and his body ached. He went to the local polyclinic where, without much thought, he was given the routine diagnosis: a severe form of the flu. It was the middle of winter, the peak of the seasonal epidemic. Everything seemed obvious. He is hospitalized in the infectious diseases ward of the prestigious Botkin Hospital. In the admissions department, the artist is examined by a young female resident, a 53-year-old man, dry cough, high fever, a strange rash appearing on his body. A few days ago, he returned from a trip to India, where, as is known, smallpox still occurs. All these symptoms are very similar to smallpox, but the patient's medical record has a clear note of a past vaccination. At that moment, the head of the department, an experienced professor, enters the office. He is irritated that the patient's admission is taking so long. When the resident timidly tells him about her suspicions, he literally laughs in her face. "My dear girl, what smallpox are you talking about? You must be reading old textbooks at night. There hasn't been a single case in the USSR for some 30 years. We have a flu epidemic in full swing, the wards are packed." "But what about the rash?" the young woman insists. The seasoned professor casts a cursory glance at Kokorekin and immediately dismisses the rash with contempt as an allergic reaction. Who knows what the artist ate or touched in that exotic India of his? "Come on, don't hold up the line. Admit him to the general ward with the flu patients." This decision would prove fatal. There are several versions of what happened next. Either the vaccine Kokorekin received in childhood was of poor quality, or its effectiveness had weakened over time, or the note in his medical record was forged to obtain permission to travel abroad. In any case, on December 29, 1959, Alexei Kokorekin died in terrible agony. His body, covered in black sores, was urgently cremated in compliance with all anti-epidemic safety measures. But not because of smallpox. During the autopsy, the pathologist, seeing the picture of total hemorrhagic damage, suspected pneumonic plague. About 2 weeks passed after Kokorekin's funeral. In mid-January, alarming rumors began to spread through the hospital. First, the nurse who had cared for the artist fell ill. Then, a boy in a ward on the floor below who had simply walked past Kokorekin's room. Then, the hospital stoker got sick. The symptoms were the same for everyone. The artist's widow was just about to go to the cemetery when there was an insistent knock on the door of her apartment on Leninsky Prospect. "Open up, militia." The officers behaved rather unceremoniously. They entered the room, sat down at the table, and began a detailed questioning about her late husband. It turned out that since the artist's death, several more people at Botkin Hospital had fallen ill with similar symptoms. On January 15th, an elderly academic virologist, Mikhail Morozov, who had been urgently summoned to the hospital, looked at biological samples from one of the patients under a microscope and discovered Pashen bodies in them. Irrefutable proof. Particles of the smallpox virus. Botkin Hospital was immediately closed under the strictest quarantine. "You are also in mortal danger," the KGB officers who had replaced the militiamen told the widow. "To stop the spread of the infection, we must urgently find absolutely everyone with whom your husband had contact after his arrival from India." Moreover, the Chekists demanded that she immediately hand over all the artist's personal belongings, and especially the souvenirs and gifts he had brought from abroad. At that moment, a man in a full chemical protection suit with a sprayer entered the room. After a minute of chilling interrogation, Kokorekin's widow remembered. One of the gifts, a beautiful Indian shawl, she had already managed to sell to a consignment shop for a reasonable price. This meant that the potentially deadly item, on which the virus could be present, could have already found a new owner and begun its journey through Moscow. They had to act with lightning speed. It soon turned out that not only the widow, but also many of Kokorekin's friends and relatives who had received exotic souvenirs from him had done the same. They had sold or regifted them. But during a special operation declared in Moscow, which involved hundreds of KGB and militia officers, all the deadly gifts were found and destroyed the very next day. The system of the totalitarian state worked with chilling inhuman efficiency. They reconstructed, minute by minute, Kokorekin's entire route and all his contacts from the moment he stepped off the plane. The customs officers on his shift, the taxi driver who took him home, the head doctor of the polyclinic, the local doctor, and all the staff and patients at the polyclinic with whom he had crossed paths. One of the people who had been in contact with the artist had even managed to fly to Paris, but the Soviet authorities were not afraid of an international scandal. The plane was turned around in mid-air and returned to Moscow, and all the passengers and crew were immediately sent to quarantine in a hospital near Moscow. A quarantine was also imposed in Moscow itself. The city was completely sealed off. Rail and air traffic with other cities was suspended. Roads were blocked by military patrols. The search for so-called first and second-degree contacts continued around the clock for 3 weeks. More than 9,000 people were found, isolated, and placed under medical observation. Simultaneously, an unprecedented vaccination campaign was launched. Liters of vaccine were produced around the clock at several facilities. Within a week, 10.5 million vaccinations were administered to the entire population of Moscow and the Moscow Oblast, from newborn infants to the very elderly. Even those dying in hospitals from other illnesses were vaccinated. This total vaccination campaign became the largest and fastest in human history, both in terms of its time frame and population coverage. As a result, thanks to these draconian but effective measures, the outbreak of the deadly infection, which could have claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, was completely localized and suppressed in just 19 days. In total, 19 cases of infection were recorded, of which 3 people died. Moscow was saved. The last case of natural smallpox infection in the world was recorded in 1977 in Somalia, in a cook named Ali Mao Maalin. And just 3 years later, on May 8, 1980, the World Health Organization officially announced at its assembly, smallpox, one of the most terrible scourges in human history, was completely eradicated. Those born in the 80s and later no longer have the characteristic round scar from the vaccination on their left shoulder. Humanity had won the war. To this day, as far as is officially known, live variola virus samples are stored in only 2 laboratories with the maximum level of biosecurity: at the Russian State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology, Vector, in Novosibirsk, and at the American Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, in Atlanta. But in 2014, a truly horrifying incident occurred when employees of the U.S. National Institutes of Health, while moving from one laboratory to another, found 6 forgotten glass vials of the smallpox virus, dated 1954, in a cardboard box inside an old refrigerator. They had simply been lying there for decades. Of course, all of this was destroyed under the strict supervision of the WHO, but the incident itself certainly makes one reflect on human negligence. Furthermore, in some regions, for example, in the Republic of the Congo, people are still very fond of feasting on the meat of wild animals, including monkeys, which, by the way, also suffer from their own monkeypox, a disease very similar to human smallpox. Should this virus just once successfully mutate and find a way to be transmitted effectively from person to person, who knows what could happen in a world where the majority of the population no longer has immunity? And here's some more food for thought. In 2002, after the panic caused by the mailing of letters with anthrax spores, U.S. President George W. Bush ordered the mandatory vaccination of all American military personnel against smallpox, both within the country and abroad. There is still no cure for this disease. The only protection is the vaccine. What if the story of the poisoned blankets from Fort Pitt is not just a page from a history textbook? What if it's a rehearsal for a future where an old biological weapon falls into new, insane hands? After all, there are enough ugly people in the world even without smallpox. Not ugly on the outside from the scars of disease, but on the inside.